Welcome to Crossroads. The World Economic Forum recently wrapped up its big 2024 conference in Davos, Switzerland, where politicians and business leaders and many others discussed their plans for censorship, pandemic preparedness, notably Disease X, and the remaking of the entire world under a new progressive agenda, which they control. Now, the meeting was met with heavy online criticism, as you can imagine, including with widespread condemnation of what they're actually referring openly to as the New World Order. Now, look, the concept of a New World Order used to be conspiracy. It's no longer just a conspiracy theory. It is now being openly discussed. They're actually calling it this. I'm not even joking. Let me show you a question that was asked during the Davos meeting. This is to Jake Sullivan, U.S. Security Advisor, and his answer. Watch.
What are we able to keep on the positive side from the old order to bring into a new world order? And how can we avoid that new world order becomes like a jungle growing back, and we rather have order based on international law and the principles that have brought us prosperity and freedom for decades.
The post-Cold War era has come to a close. We're at the start of something new. We have the capacity to shape what that looks like. And at the heart of it will be many of the core principles and core institutions of the existing order, adapted for the challenges that we face today.
Of course, a big question is, well, what is exactly the New World Order? What does it actually refer to? I think it may differ from person to person, but remember, a key agenda that's pushed by the World Economic Forum, in fact, by the founder, the main guy himself, Klaus Schwab, he's pushing the idea of a so-called Great Reset, and this is not a conspiracy theory. He literally wrote a book on it, and the title is actually The Great Reset, and it talks about how to use COVID-19 as a way to usher this in. They talk about this idea, the Great Reset, as a replacement of the global order that we live under, the normal system that we've lived under for most of human history. They want to replace that with what they call a multi-stakeholder model of government. And what is the multi-stakeholder model? Well, it's essentially a call to break down the systems of the world. Of course, the Great Reset, you reset the world, right? And then when you build back better, you do something different with it. When you start all the systems back up. And part of the starting back up, what they want to implement is this multi-stakeholder model that includes subverting the authority of elected government. In most countries on earth, we live under various forms of democracy, and even a republic is representative democracy. We elect our leaders. They want to change that by having it so that the control of countries is not just under elected government. And what they want to do, the multi-stakeholder model, who are the stakeholders? Well, they want to grant shared government power to corporations, investors, NGOs, bankers, and other unelected officials, notably themselves. So in other words, what they're calling for is essentially a global coup d'etat. They want to overthrow democracy. They're trying to replace it with a new form of international totalitarianism, which they want to be in control of. They're trying to subvert and replace the authority of elected government with a system that ironically benefits the very people pushing for these things, notably them. And they're using doomsday narratives like a doomsday cult, trying to justify this. They're pushing narratives on global warming, global pandemics, Disease X, similar issues like this, and they're using them as Trojan horses to justify the ushering in of a new vision of what they call the so-called New World Order, and that's what it refers to. Case in point, the agenda, ironically, against farmers. We hear so much about it. They're trying to get rid of farmers. They're culling cattle. They're making it so there's restrictions on nitrogen, so you can't put fertilizer on your farm. They want to limit all these things. They're closing farmers down. Now, one of the big things they have is, of course, justifying this under the narrative of fighting global warming. And just case in point, there was a clip going viral from the World Economic Forum just recently from their agenda contributor, Hubert Keller, explaining why coffee, the coffee we drink, most of us every morning, is actually a problem for global warming. Watch.
On the nature side, basically, the coffee that we all drink emits between 15 and 20 tons of CO2 per ton of coffee. So we should all know that this is every time we drink coffee, we are basically putting CO2 into the atmosphere. The other, and one of the reasons is because most of the coffee plantation, or most of the coffee is produced through monoculture, and monoculture is also affected by climate change.
Well, you heard it right. Drinking coffee is now a cause of climate change. But it's actually beyond this. They say it's not just drinking coffee, it's also the farming practices behind the growing of coffee beans. And keep in mind, this is not just empty talk. They're not just criticizing the normal way of life. The people pushing these agendas are trying to dismantle things that they claim are causing these problems. And that includes even destroying farms, culling cattle, restricting fertilizers, and ironically, setting a stage for an actual, very real global catastrophe. So in their attempts to fight against the imaginary doomsday, they're creating one. And then there are things like censorship and totalitarian government. You know, what is the New World Order? What is the system we live under? Well, keep in mind, they're not pushing for freedom. They're calling for new systems to restrict freedom. And they're saying that freedom is ironically the threat they're going against. You know, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is even saying that for the so-called global business community, climate change is not the real problem they're focused on. She's saying it's something else. For these individuals, she claims, the biggest problem in the world is what she calls disinformation and misinformation. Watch.
Dear Klaus, your annual global risk report makes for a stunning and sobering read. For the global business community, the top concern for the next 2 years is not conflict or climate. It is disinformation and misinformation, followed closely by polarization within our societies. These risks are serious because they limit our ability to tackle the big global challenges we are facing. Changes in our climate and our geopolitical climate.
Interesting. So what they're saying essentially is that because, you know, how can they alter the way we live? How can they usher in the new world order if people like us are able to question, debate, and maybe even expose the things they're doing? They're saying that the freedom of information, the ability of us to have open debates, is a threat to their power. And they're saying this is the greatest challenge that we're facing. Not climate change, not a food crisis. It's the ability of individuals to question the integrity, maybe even the basic sanity of these people. And remember, the issue, with narratives on misinformation and disinformation, they're not often targeted at actual misinformation or disinformation. If New York Times comes out and says disinformation is a problem for the elections, I personally don't think they're talking about actual disinformation. If Joe Biden comes out and bangs his hands and says the MAGA extremists are trying to rig the election with misinformation, I'm probably going to assume he's not talking about actual false information. Because of the way we've seen these things been done, when we talk about these narratives, we often see that legitimate news is being censored, and that people who question or expose the agendas, they're the ones being silenced. Ironically, disinformation is a way to push false narratives while ironically trying to crush real news, is it the way we often see it. And look, remember as well, this also isn't just empty talk either. Here's the European Commissioner's Vice President for Values and Transparency on the actual efforts they're trying to implement right now to crush online free speech. Watch.
After Mr. Musk took over the Twitter with his freedom of speech absolutism, we are the protectors of freedom of speech as well. But at the same time, we cannot accept, for instance, the illegal content online and so on. So our message was clear: we have the rules which have to be complied with, and otherwise there will be sanctions.
Now, look, if you listen to what she's saying, she's pushing two different narratives. She's saying that they protect free speech. They protect free speech, but free speech has its limits because guess what? They can't allow illegal content. So the question is, what is the so-called illegal content? Well, we can look at some examples of this. If we remember, she's criticizing Elon Musk here. She's saying Elon Musk is the problem. He's allowing people to have free speech absolutism, and that includes illegal content. So what was it like before Elon Musk took over Twitter? If you remember what Twitter was like before Elon Musk, there was child pornography on the website. And the child pornography was not being stopped despite all the systems of censorship. And the child pornography, interestingly, was stopped almost immediately after Elon Musk bought the company. So what did Elon Musk do to stop actual illegal content, child pornography, one of the worst things I can think of, from being on X or Twitter, whereas the people before couldn't, and they didn't have a problem with that. Look, so the key is they're not talking about illegal things like we would normally think of them. They're not talking about stopping, the abuse of children on these websites, because Musk did that. He put an end to something they did not, interestingly, seem to have much of a problem with before all this. And again, they didn't seem to have an issue with that, right? So what is the illegal content they're actually referring to? Well, look, this is just a loaded term for so-called hate speech. For allegations of racism and, mostly it seems for people debunking, exposing, and notably criticizing the global agendas that they're trying to push, the so-called misinformation and disinformation. They're more concerned about that, it seems, than child pornography because they didn't have a problem with it before. And they say they have rules that we have to follow, rules that have to be complied with, or else there will be sanctions. But I question, look, tyrannical dictators have always hid their actions under the guise of law. Because if a tyrant takes power somewhere, they control the arms of the law. They can say the Nazis had rules. They had laws. There were rules you couldn't break. The Chinese Communist Party has laws and rules you can't break. The Soviet Union had rules. It doesn't mean that the rules are good or just because they implement them. Case in point, remember prison guards at concentration camps often said that they were just following orders. It was the law, and they were merely enforcing the law. Just because it's a rule or an order or a law does not mean that it's something you should just follow, does not mean that it's just good or just. And if they're talking about trying to censor Americans using the rules of European socialism, well, look, these are things that go against, ironically, American law. In fact, I would say the European laws they're trying to enforce on X, an American company, violate the constitutional laws of the United States. And so how can we allow Europe to violate American law using this narrative? Well, look, again, this ties into the globalist New World Order, as they're calling it. The global government and the working together of these international, elites, as they even call themselves openly, to try to have a one world system they're trying to force on all of us. And they seem to believe that they can dictate the freedoms and restrictions of people everywhere in the world, including right here in the United States, forcing totalitarian laws in other countries. I've said it before and I'll say it again. What does it mean if Twitter or X has to fold to, let's say, the censorship laws of Europe, or maybe the censorship laws of the Chinese Communist Party further down the road, maybe the censorship laws of North Korea? Do we allow the worst abusers of violations of free speech to go against the constitutional protections we have in the United States? What happens if we allow the lowest common denominator of freedom to dictate the level of freedom everywhere in the world? If we let Europe censor Americans based on European totalitarian law, which this is, What does it mean then if other countries try to do the exact same thing using the exact same narratives? And that's the problem we're facing, of course, with global governance and the New World Order. And look, maybe this ties into the problem of the threat of the so-called geopolitical climate. Freedom of speech is a threat to the global political agenda that some of these individuals seem to be pushing. Because it seems the problem for them is not just freedom of speech. Interestingly, the problem for many of them seems to be freedom in general, freedom overall. In fact, the Federalist had this. It said the nation's ruling class holds deeply authoritarian opinions, widely divorced from the rest of the American electorate, finds a survey out this week, and it found that nearly 60% of American elites, remember the World Economic Forum, they call themselves openly the elites, think there is too much individual freedom in America. Meanwhile, it says nearly 60% of registered voters have the exact opposite opinion, reporting the United States has too much top-down control limiting liberty. The study titled Them versus Us defined the American elite as having a postgraduate degree, a household income of more than $150,000 annually, and living in a zip code with more than 10,000 people per square mile, a city in other words. Such people account for about 1% of Americans, and the study also examined the subsample of the 1% who graduated from Ivy League schools or other name-brand institutions such as Northwestern, Duke, Stanford, and the University of Chicago. Now, let me show you the actual report. Again, it's titled Them versus Us, the Two Americas, and How the Nation's Elite is Out of Touch with the Average Americans. And it's from the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. Here's what it found. It says this, key findings. In a time when most Americans have suffered a loss of real take-home pay, 74% of elites say they are financially better off today than in the past versus 20% of all Americans. It says nearly 6 in 10 say there is too much individual freedom in America, double the rate of all Americans. It says more than 2/3, 67%, favor rationing of vital energy and food resources. They want to give us food rations to combat the threat of climate change. It says that in stark contrast to the rest of America, 70% of the elites trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. It says 2/3, again 67%, say teachers and other educational professionals should decide what children are taught rather than letting their parents decide. And it says somewhere between half and 2/3 favor banning things like SUVs, gas stoves, air conditioning, and non-essential air travel to protect the environment. And I will remind you, most of the people at Davos, a lot of them seem to have private jets. They want to get rid of us being able to have air travel unless it's essential. While we can assume that they deem themselves essential and everything they do is essential, this is a two-tiered system of the global New World Order. It also says about 6 of 10 elites have a favorable opinion of the so-called talking professions, lawyers, lobbyists, politicians, and the worst, journalists. It says President Joe Biden enjoys an 84% job approval rating from this group, roughly twice as high as the general public. Are you getting that, folks? Now, when they say that they're out of touch with the average person, I would have to agree. But all this being said, some of the globalist agendas are too extreme, even for many of the folks who we used to see as extreme. Take DEI, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in particular, the concept of equity. The agenda of equity over equality, right? Equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. Equity is, you have equal outcome no matter what you do. This is too extreme, even for Bernie Sanders, who is for a long time the main socialist politician in the United States. Watch what he has to say.
A lot of people hear equity and they hear equality. It's the same word, and it's not the same word in the same concept. So how would you differentiate between equity and equality?
Well, equality, we talk about, I don't know what the answer to that is. Come to think of it, equality is equality of opportunity. All right? We live in a society, we want all people
Right.
to have whatever color your skin is.
Equity, I think, is more guarantee of outcome, is it not?
I think so. I think that's
Okay. So which side do you come down on?
Equality.
Equality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Now, look, regardless of any of this, even at the World Economic Forum this year, there were actually some pretty big criticisms, notably using the stage at the World Economic Forum to criticize the World Economic Forum. One of them who criticized it was the new president of Argentina, that's Javier Milei, and he went viral for some of his statements. Let me show you what he had to say.
Today, I'm here to tell you that the Western world is in danger. And it is endangered because those who are supposed to have to defend the values of the West are co-opted by a vision of the world that inexorably leads to socialism and thereby to poverty. Unfortunately, in recent decades, motivated by some well-meaning individuals willing to help others, and others motivated by the wish to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the Western world have abandoned the model of freedom for different versions of what we call collectivism. We're here to tell you that collectivist experiments are never the solution to the problems that afflict the citizens of the world. Rather, they are the root cause. Do believe me, no one better placed than us, Argentines, to testify to these 2 points. When we adopted the model of freedom back in 1860, in 35 years we became a leading world power. And when we embraced collectivism over the course of the last 100 years, we saw how our citizens started to become systematically impoverished, and we dropped to spot number 140 globally.
Now look, Milei is hitting on some of the key principles of classic Austrian economics. And what he's referring to, I believe, is interventionist policies meant to, often make problems worse. And of course, socialist interventionism. What does this actually mean? What is interventionism? It's the idea of trying to micromanage everything with a purely top-down system. The government, for example, subsidizes a certain good. The government, for example, tries to control or subsidize a certain industry. They try to mandate the creation of a certain product. They subsidize things to intervene in the marketplace. And what happens when they do that? As soon as they intervene, as soon as they create a product that cannot fail, as soon as they create a business that cannot go out of business, as soon as they try to dictate what people can or can't buy, it causes disruptions in the marketplace that, interestingly, oftentimes have the opposite effect. When you have socialist interventionism, for example, let's say Joseph Stalin takes the podium and says, I demand the creation of, iron pots all around the country. In China, they had something like this, and what happened? Vladimir Lenin, under the Soviet Union, also seized a lot of farming implements, iron, and so on. What happened in China? Of course, Mao Zedong came out and said, we need to, create new, we have to do like a farmer's revolution. We have to seize all the iron in all of China. And what happened? You had farmers taking their farming implements, their hoes and everything else like that, the things they need to grow their crops, giving them away, melting them down. You had people giving their household pots and pans that they used to cook their meals to the government. The government, of course, took all these things and melted it all down into pig iron, and it was almost completely useless, the end product, because the quality of the iron was so bad because of how they did this. Meanwhile, they started having massive crop failures and mass starvation because they took everybody's farming implements. It's a perfect example of socialist interventionism. In mainland China, under the Chinese Communist Party, they launched a campaign of what they called sparrow warfare because they declared that, the CCP came out and said, if we can only get rid of the sparrows that eat the crops, we will, of course, have more crops, because they were arguing, you grow all these crops and these evil capitalist birds come and eat the food that the people grow. So what happened? They started this sparrow war where people were encouraged to kill those little birds. And what happened? They killed all the birds and then insects ravaged their crops, and people starved to death. Same thing in a lot of other areas, by the way. The idea of socialist interventionism is the idea, of course, under socialism, government seizes the means of production. Government creates an absolute form of power from the top down, and they believe they can micromanage the, policies and everything else of every single business and every single individual across the entire country. The new agenda is the entire world. And of course, when they make these sweeping policies, they're oftentimes disconnected from the unique realities on the ground that exist and often differ from one place to the next. They tend to create more problems than they solve because they don't take into account nuance or other factors that people may bring up if they try to criticize, hey, that may not be a good idea because the birds eat the bugs and the bugs eat the crops. Many problems we face are being caused by the very people who claim they want to solve them. In fact, this was one of the big discussions at the World Economic Forum this year. They brought in Kevin Roberts of the Heritage Foundation as kind of the ordinary person. He was the spokesperson for the average man, because remember, we're talking about these polls they've done on the elites, and 67% and 60% roughly believe that the average person has too much freedom and they're smarter than everybody else, and they just need to restrict our ability to drive SUVs and fly in airplanes and so on like that. Only they should be able to do it. So the question was, well, who are these average people who we are so disconnected from? Well, they brought in Kevin Roberts to explain to them what normal people think, and especially what they think about the possible return of Donald Trump and what it means to them. Let me show you what Kevin Roberts had to say at the World Economic Forum.
It's laughable that you would, or anyone would, describe Davos as protecting liberal democracy. It's equally,
standing up for it.
It's equally laughable to use the word dictatorship at Davos and aim that at President Trump. In fact, I think that's absurd. But I'm going to step aside from that constructive criticism and instead answer your question.
Yep.
And I'm going to be substantive here. President Trump, if he's the next president, for that matter, I think whoever the next conservative president, is going to take on the power of the elites, which I mentioned earlier. But the thing that I want to drive home here, the very reason that I'm here at Davos, is to explain to many people in this room and who are watching, with all due respect, nothing personal, but that you're part of the problem.
Now, look, it's actually interesting because one of the big narratives that was pushed by everybody from Klaus Schwab to a lot of the speakers was this concept and this concern they're expressing that people no longer seem to respect them. There's a disconnect between the global elites and the average person. They see Trump as representing this phenomenon. Trump, they would say, represents a populist movement, a representative of the common man, the average person, the normal citizen. And for some reason, they're saying, the average citizen no longer seems to believe the authorities. They don't trust the science. They don't believe these so-called experts. They believe that government policies are out to harm them in many cases rather than help them. And they believe, honestly, that frankly, a lot of these policies have had the opposite effect of what they claim to do. And one of the big topics you heard across the board at the World Economic Forum is how to deal with this. Interestingly, the big solution was censor them. The big solution was we need to get rid of the things that constitute the basic way of life. And, why don't they trust us when all we're trying to do is strip away their freedoms, get rid of their air conditioners, take away their coffee, get rid of their meat, change their ways of life, make it so they have no privacy, censor them, and see what else we can do to them maybe in the future. Why don't they believe us? Why don't they trust us? Gee, I don't know. And of course, all of this being said, there is now proposed legislation right here in the United States to stop giving taxpayer money to the World Economic Forum. And yes, I was shocked to learn this. Apparently, by the way, we've actually been giving money to the World Economic Forum, our tax dollars. The bill to stop this, and again, we'll see if it ever gets passed, it was introduced by Representative Scott Perry from, it's all Republicans, along with others including Tom Tiffany and Representative Paul Gosar. Let me show you the bill. It's called To Prohibit Funding for the World Economic Forum. And it said, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, It says this act may be cited as the Defund Davos Act. And it says no funds available to the Department of State, the United States Agency for International Development, or any other department or agency may be used to provide funding for the World Economic Forum. In other words, despite all the attempts to intervene in the basic perceptions of the average man, to make it so that we all trust them yet again by trying to censor us and rolling out preparations for Disease X, which I'll talk about tomorrow because we need a whole episode just to talk about that. Yes, they're talking about Disease X and how to save us from ourselves, all of our dangerous opinions and the dangerous decisions we make, like eating meat and drinking coffee and using air conditioners. Now, as all this happens, of course, again, we'll see where it goes, but this is dividing the world into two main camps. Of course, the elites and the common individual, the populist movement that is now rising up all around the world, not just here in the United States, and the global shift now taking place, interestingly, as the so-called elites try to implement the New World Order. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into some questions. Let's see here. Bizarre times we're living in, right? All right, at least they're like doing it in person. At least they're doing it publicly and they're not meeting in like creepy groves with owl statues and stuff like that, right? Am I right? All right, Jackie Hale, you're saying, will Starbucks cancel itself? Jackie, I think you have a great social movement that could be implemented, the encouragement of Starbucks to cancel itself, to save itself and all of us from global warming. We should all remind them that coffee is in fact a contributor to global warming and that we need to offset this by having them close all their stores. Actually, I have something interesting I wanted to talk to all you about. I had an interesting conversation recently. I had just random, I meet a lot of individuals on the road while traveling around. One of the individuals I talked to actually works in the industry of these, they call them climate credits, where, of course, businesses, they have to try to get climate credits. Case in point, do you remember the story where we were saying that the headlines read something like, Bill Gates wants to cut down all the trees and then bury them? Do you remember that? Now, the reality of that story was this. There was a company that Bill Gates had invested in, and it was being framed as a company that was trying to get carbon credits. And the policy was they wanted to cut down forests or trees and then bury the wood. And the concept was, right, the argument they had was that were a forest fire to take place, every single tree, if it were to catch on fire and burn, would emit X amount of carbon, right? Because if you burn a tree, it creates carbon emissions. And so to prevent the hypothetical carbon emissions were a forest fire to take place, the proposed solution would be to cut down these trees and bury them under the earth so that in the future they could not catch on fire and create carbon or, could contribute to global warming. The reality of this is that it's a scam, at least in my opinion, to collect carbon credits. And there's actually a huge business on carbon credits. The way this agenda works is they start up all these different companies that create, green initiatives. One of the big things the World Economic Forum, supports are these green initiatives. And what are these? It's part of, at least in my opinion, a giant scam. It's a giant con job of creating businesses that pretend they're having a positive global footprint or reducing carbon emissions, like cutting down trees that might hypothetically catch on fire and burn and create carbon emissions so they bury them, things like that. So what do? They calculate the amount of carbon that they have offset, right? The X amount of carbon that has been prevented from going into the atmosphere by burying the trees, for example. And then they sell those credits to companies. That's how the scam works. And so let's say that they have this program of cutting down the trees and burying them to prevent this. The calculated amount of carbon that has been prevented from going into the atmosphere, because they're saying, hypothetically, if they caught fire, it would have created X amount of, carbon emissions, right? they take that amount and they sell it to companies. And so companies have to buy these carbon credits, meaning they have to subsidize these fake, ridiculous companies that actually do nothing good for the world and nothing good for the environment, that just create these fake carbon credits and then sell them to businesses. And there are people getting stinking, absolutely rich off of this scam. But because they mandate that companies have to have these carbon credits, it has created this alternate economy. And people are creating these ridiculous con jobs, this snake oil salesman type stuff, in order to game this system that they have created. And you have, of course, different countries like China and so on that just fake a lot of it. In fact, they found when they investigated some of these carbon credit, mills, it's oftentimes nothing. They're not doing anything of benefit, or it's just fake in its entirety. But the carbon credits actually don't matter. And so when they talk about net zero, what they mean is buying up the amount of carbon credits that would equal the amount of carbon that the company itself would emit. Which is why you have like oil companies that are being deemed as green, for example, that are trying to achieve net zero, not because they're stopping the emission of carbon emissions, if you even believe the narrative, of course, but because they're buying up carbon credits in order to offset their carbon emissions, which means they're financing this massive scam, this huge scam that's being run, which is part of the global narrative. And these individuals are getting stinking rich by doing this, what I would say, just a giant snake oil salesman con job on the entire world. Anyways, wild stuff, right? And by the way, I was told that even the guys who sell these carbon credits, because I was talking to one of them, they don't believe in it. A lot of them are like Republican Trump supporters and stuff, but they're opportunists. It's just a way to make money for them. All right, before we go into more questions, don't forget we have a new documentary, The Real Story of January 6th, Part 2, and you can watch that only on Epoch TV. In fact, you're watching on YouTube right now. They'll probably kick me off if I show it to you. So jump over to Epoch TV if you want to see that. I'll show you the trailer for that, actually, and then we'll go into some more questions.
Calling the January 6th investigation the biggest investigation in FBI history.
There are more than 1,100 arrests, and they show no signs of slowing down.
When you take an oath, you have to abide by it.
They're just going to identify you on video, arrest you, and then figure out what the evidence is after that.
Those involved must be held accountable.
He's an innocent man, and he has been punished for something that he never did. Every day you wake up and you're like, how did I get out of bed today?
You have to stay away from the word patriot now because that's a terrorist organization.
We interviewed 2 whistleblowers from the FBI.
I sacrificed my dream job to share this information with the American people.
That siege was criminal behavior, plain and simple, and it's behavior that we, the FBI, view as domestic terrorism.
We started with death threats, the hate mail.
I don't care what they do to me, but I do care what they do to my family.
Our family struggles every day.
It's going to change narratives no matter what your political perspective is.
All right, welcome back. Again, that documentary is only on Epoch TV. I cannot show you it on YouTube. They will probably ban me for it. But back into some questions, and real quick too. If you want to watch it, head over. We have a lot of other great documentaries. A lot of my investigative work is there. EpochTV.com, EpochTV.com. All right, let's see here. Linda 2010, you're saying, so now even coffee will be limited to the elites? Well, we'll see what they try to do. The reality is, when it comes to the agenda on the food front, they're trying to, interestingly, restrict farming overall. They're making policies where they're trying to force farmers to cull their cattle. You have actually, some major stuff happening in Europe right now. Ireland, for example, where they tried to force farmers to cull like 200,000 cattle or something insane like that. They've started up, or maybe more than that, they started up a new farmer political party pushing back against it. In Germany, you have massive farmer protests pushing back against this. In the Netherlands, for example, where they tried to implement these new, socialist, I would call them socialist policies of trying to restrict nitrates, which is eliminating the ability of farmers to use, certain amounts of fertilizer, and even trying to regulate cattle because they say that cattle, because they fart and, defecate and everything like else, that is representing carbon emissions, so they have to kill the cows in order to save the environment. Because they're pushing these things, you have a lot of pushback, interestingly, from farmers and people who are losing their land and people who are raising alarms saying, look, if they keep doing this, they're going to cause a global famine. They're going to cause mass starvation. They're going to kill us if they keep doing this. And, it's interesting that you have, the United Nations warning about the threat of global starvation. And meanwhile, you have these nutcases at Davos trying to restrict farming. What is the logic in that? How can you have that logic where on one side you can say there's a risk of global starvation. People are going to die of starvation because there's not enough food. And on the other side you can say we need to restrict farming and kill the cows and get rid of farmland and build who knows what in order to protect the climate, to save us from dying, but they're going to kill us by doing that. Like, what is the logic in this? And frankly, I'd say this is one of the reasons why rational, normal people think these people are nuts. Nuts at the very least and evil at the very most, I'd say. Maybe a combination of the two, in fact. And yeah, coffee is just one of the examples they're giving, talking about the narrative of coffee is what they're using as an example of the problems with farming in general. Miss Terry, you're saying, is coffee such a problem? What part of CO2 did they miss about buying all our goods from China? Yeah, like international shipping, right, which they subsidize, by the way. Got to stop buying made in China if we follow that logic. Actually, because they subsidize shipments from China, speaking of state interventionism, it would not be doable. It would not be affordable to have mass trade like we do coming from China were it not for these subsidies. And so, if you want to ship something from China to the U.S. or, elsewhere, a lot of the costs of that shipping are offset through these, interventionist policies. And it makes it so it's very hard for companies here to compete with things being sold, ironically, from the other side of the world. Actually, I was in Taiwan just recently. I was looking out my window of the airplane, normal airplane, flying coach, looking out the window, and I remember looking and seeing all these lights, because it was nighttime, and I was like, man, what are those? I thought we were flying over land for a minute. It was shipping container ships, tons of them. Because, when you're flying to Taiwan from, the U.S., you do travel over, the southeastern tip of China. You actually do fly over the coastline. There were just tons, more shipping container ships than I've ever seen. And so the CCP has been able to become one of the largest exporters, ironically, because of state interventionism. And what would normally be an unaffordable and unsustainable practice, when we talk about actual sustainability, is being made artificially sustainable and affordable only because of these interventionist policies, these subsidies where, we shoulder the cost of international shipping and offset that for the CCP so they can get stinking rich on it. James Dyson, you're saying, here's my solution for carbon emissions, made in the USA. Yeah, I fully agree, James. In fact, I don't think a country can go without producing anything for a long time before you lose your ability to innovate. I think that having an unproductive society where, frankly, all the jobs are just middle management jobs, you're going to have people not wanting to do it. You're going to have people playing roles that feel empty. People work, but they create nothing. You're not going to be able to sustain a country like that, especially as over time the manufacturing, the experience, the people who are on the ground and building things, and the ability to innovate based on how they understand things work is being done in other countries where we're offshoring it, it's not going to be sustainable. You want to talk about, again, real sustainability. That's not going to work out well for us within maybe just a couple generations. We're going to destroy ourselves if we keep doing that, I think. Truth be known, you're saying, I think the WEF, World Economic Forum, has too much freedom of speech. Yeah, well, you know, if you want to like push for agendas to manufacture global starvation, I would say that you've overstepped the boundaries of you know, friendly government and acceptable speech. If you're talking about policies to manufacture like global genocide because you're going to starve people to death by eliminating the food on their plate, I'd say you're pretty dang evil. And I'd say that's a whole lot worse than, you know, maybe Trump's mean tweets, which is one of the big problems they have, or people questioning the mental stability of the people pushing these agendas. You know, I think we're putting our priorities in the wrong place here, personally. You know, Gila Andhut, you're saying, what gave them that power? Where are all the government leaders? Well, interestingly, the World Economic Forum includes most government leaders. The issue with World Economic Forum is that it's kind of like it's subversive, to put it plainly. In my opinion, it is a subversive movement because they bring in all of the government leaders, all the elites, you know, quote unquote, and then they try to make the governments share the power of governing societies with unelected leaders. Business leaders, NGOs, investors, elites tied in with their little club network, people like Klaus Schwab and the people around him, people who have no power and no authority technically, but who are trying to change the system of government, you know, the Great Reset and the multi-stakeholder capitalism model they want, in order to give themselves power that has not been granted to them through elections or by the people they're trying to gain control over. This, in a very real sense, I think, is a coup d'etat. This is a revolution. They're trying to subvert the systems of government of the world and alter the systems of government we have in order to give them and their crony buddies power over us. And you know, I find that pretty problematic. I think that they should be regarded as a revolutionary movement. They should be regarded as people trying to launch an insurrection to seize and alter the forms of government of the United States and other countries in the world. They should be seen as no different than, you know, the insurrectionists they claim tried to overthrow democracy. Because ironically, I would say these people are in fact trying to overthrow democracy. They're trying to eliminate the system of elected governance by creating a system, interestingly, of unelected governance, which gives power to them and their buddies. Gina Mikulik, you're saying no meat, no coffee, no cars, no pets, no children, no food, no faith, no privacy, no freedom. This is what these demons are trying to usher in. Actually, Gina, I think you hit the nail on the head. Maybe they should just make that the slogan to eliminate confusion. World Economic Forum, no meat, no coffee, no cars, no pets, no children, no food, no faith, no privacy, no freedom. It would simplify their message, I think, because everything you're saying here does represent what many people at those conferences are pushing for. Ashley from California, you're saying, are we becoming idiocracy? Yeah, it's a reference to a movie, by the way. There was a movie called Idiocracy. And the trailer went viral for it. Essentially, it's I call it a black comedy, I think. The concept of idiocracy is where the smart people stop reproducing, right? They're saying, oh, you know, I need to get through college before I think about having kids. We should use birth control because I don't want to, you know, damage my career. And they, you know, the smart, educated people just stop having children. But the people who start having kids are the people who don't think like that. They're not thinking about consequences or long-term life goals or anything like that. And so it creates this kind of, you know, reverse this kind of reverse policy of trying to micromanage genetics. And what they do is they breed all of the idiots, right? All the idiots are the people who have kids, and it creates the idiocracy where the intelligence has been over time bred out of society. It's a funny concept, a funny movie. Personally, I'd say that ironically, the smart people tend to be the ones who probably don't go to Ivy League colleges and so on these days. I think it's flipped these days. The people who can think for themselves, but it's still a funny concept, right? Judith Yakim, you say, and actually, funny note, I've been told this by a few people. I was told by Alan dos Santos. He's a Brazilian journalist who's hated by the leftist government there. In fact, he's on the run from them. He was saying that he was talking to Olavo de Carvalho before Olavo de Carvalho died. Great Brazilian philosopher and journalist as well. And Olavo made the point, he was like, the communists in the time of Karl Marx and all these guys, they were like poets and writers. They were like the intellectuals. They were the intellectual elite of their countries. And they were, trying to push for all these complicated narratives. And, even though, in my opinion, they were evil, they were absolutely evil, a lot of them were very smart. The difference with communists these days is they are absolute morons. They're the stupidest people alive. And I would say you can look at, frankly, a lot of the stuff they do. They're not playing with a full deck of cards, if you know what I mean. Like, you're not going to have most communists these days who even read half the books they talk about. Like, they're not well educated. They're not intelligent individuals. And ironically, the way this was told to me is because the communists subverted the education system. And if you subvert the education system and you make it so you're just training good factory workers, which notably, in America, in most of the free world, we're practicing the Prussian system of education. Public education is based on the Prussian model, which is not made to make you smart. It is made to make you a good factory worker. The Prussian model of the public education system is meant to teach you to be a worker drone, basically. And that was, of course, subverted by the Owenites, a communist group, and so on. And there was an intentional dumbing down of people. They wanted to manufacture illiteracy. They have the new agendas under, Obama's forced, government curriculum where they redid math, where they have just math that doesn't even make logical sense. It's because they're trying to make you stupid. And because and by the way, great series on this by Alex Newman that you can read in the Epoch Times. And I think he's reworking that series into a book right now. Alex Newman, AlexNewmann. And if you want to read his stories on the Epoch Times, he has a fantastic series on this. But, this intentional dumbing down of our education system to create just people who follow orders, basically. People who are incapable of independent thought, and especially incapable of poetic or Benedictine thought, where they can think beyond the boundaries of established knowledge. You eliminate those people. The issue that the communists and socialists have had, though, is that the people who've risen up to become the new leaders of the communist movement are also products of the idiocracy, of the dumbing down of the education system. The morons, they're idiots. And, the more they go into this system of, idiot, education, the dumber they get. And so you have people who are just utterly incapable of independent thinking. They don't understand it. And that's the problem. Interestingly, I'd say you can actually understand some of the debates we had with like COVID-19 and lockdowns and why won't you trust the science? Why don't you trust the experts? It's because people think for themselves. And ironically, the people who have tried forcing these policies on us, they don't think like that. I would say they're not capable of independent thought. They've deferred their logic to external experts. And even if what the external experts are saying does not make logical sense, they still follow it because they've deferred that type of, basic discernment to an external source. When they question, why is it that we've lost control over the information systems? Why is it that people don't believe us anymore? It's because, ironically, the average person is smarter than they give credit to. And even if people don't have like official, advanced degrees and stuff like that, It doesn't mean the person cannot discern information. I'd say, ironically, a lot of the people who've avoided doing that are more capable of independent thought than the ones who have. And, interestingly, I'd say, again, that's part of the cultural shift we've had take place in this country and in a lot of the world, that the global elites just plain old don't understand. Why won't people listen to us? It's because they have independent thought, and through their own discernment, they don't think you're credible anymore, frankly. Why is it that YouTubers have more of an audience these days than the major news networks? It's because people have, they have their own discernment, and they can say, I discern that what this guy is telling me is fake. They just don't believe it like they used to, Judy Akeem, you're saying, which one of the elites would stop drinking their coffee, I wonder? They imagine the plebes are going back to feudalistic standards of rights and them as kings and queens still enjoying their privileges. They just want global slavery. Judy, I think you're 100% accurate. And I'd say that's also what socialism always has been. A lot of people frame socialism as a system to create power. It's people pushing it. The people oftentimes trying to advocate for communist revolution and socialism, they oftentimes don't plan to live as the average person under that system. Usually when they're pushing it, they imagine themselves as the leaders. When they talk about seizing the means of production and, equality under the one system of government, they don't mean that they're going to be equal to you. They don't mean that they're going to live as poor as you do. They imagine themselves as living like kings and queens, as you mentioned. And you always see this. And they imagine everybody else living in, your pod, eating your bugs and everything else. They see themselves eating their steak and lobster, which they do at these meetings, while the rest of us are eating our cricket burgers. That's how they see it. When they talk about eliminating, non-essential air travel, look, many of these people have private yachts and private jets. They're not talking about themselves. So yeah, case in point. Richard Flanagan, you're saying, who decides what is disinformation / misinformation? Yeah, Richard, that's one of the big flaws in the agenda they're trying to push. We need to get rid of false information. Okay, but who says what's true and what's false? We need to get rid of all information that is not verified. Well, who verifies it? If you talk about, for example, the history of even, scientific development, there were people in the past who were not able to present scientific findings because it was deemed fake before it even began, because you weren't allowed to debate it. Historically we look at that as being a darker time in world history where we couldn't have open discussions around observable reality. You know what I mean? And the problem you had was that when a group of individuals become the gatekeepers of what is true and what is false and what can be discussed and what cannot be discussed, maybe it works for a little bit. Maybe you have a few enlightened elites who just have the absolute ability to discern truth from falsehoods and, just see through all illusions. I don't know if anybody's capable of that, but maybe that's how they imagine themselves. But oftentimes that doesn't happen. Oftentimes what you have happen is that you have people who just choose to not believe in some things or try to crush things that go against their personal interest, even if it is true. You can look, for example, at many of the false narratives that have been pushed, ironically, by the people on the other side. The whole narrative, it's safe and effective, 100% safe and effective. That's false. The lab leak origin of the virus is pure disinformation and should be crushed. It is racist if you say it came from China. Well, that's false. Now they're even admitting it. Trump colluded with Russia to rig the 2016 election. Turns out they lied about that. It was actually disinformation funded, ironically, by the DNC and the Clinton campaign. The list goes on and on and on. Many of the things they tell you are false turn out to be true, and many of the things they tell you are true turn out to be false. But they, because they try to make themselves the gatekeepers of truth and falsehood, use ironically that power to crush the people who they see as threats to their own fake narratives. The way that free speech was fathers, because if you want to talk about how do we arrive at truth, right? How do we arrive at truth? I would say that most religions have talked a lot about, the religious nature of truth. That you know, from Christianity to Taoism to, I'd say upright religions, they talk about the pursuit of truth. And how do you arrive at that? Well, a lot of times it's through, of course, open discussion. You can talk about the Socratic method where, you know, through dialogue and asking questions, we can arrive at truth. You can talk about the ability of individuals from different perspectives to find common ground with each other. The way the Founding Fathers imagined is the way of, for example, getting rid of fake rumors and so on, was not through censorship and not through restricting the ability of people to even criticize the government. In fact, even seditious speech was allowed under, you know, the Founding Fathers, which was, of course, the debate around the Alien and Sedition Act, by the way. And, you know, the way they imagined it was the marketplace of ideas, just like in a free market where if something works, it succeeds, and if something fails, it doesn't work, it goes out of business. The same thing with ideas, that if you have the marketplace of ideas, in other words, the market economy applied to truth and falsehood, that naturally through debate, lies will be exposed and what is true will be recognized. That is the marketplace of ideas, and that is the nature of free speech and the way that we arrive at truth through free speech. Yes, there are going to be people making stupid and false statements, but you should be able to criticize them. You should be able to question them. And through that process of public discernment and public criticism, yes, you can expose what is false and you can arrive at truth. In fact, I'd say that, you know, my news show attempts to do that, and I think a lot of independent news shows attempt to do that. And we're a thorn in the side, ironically, the people trying to do the opposite, I'd say. Because, hey, you know, welcome to the marketplace of ideas, folks, where we can have open discussions. Richard Flanagan, yeah, sorry, I read that already. All right, folks, that's end it for today. Join me tomorrow. We'll be talking about Disease X, which is what the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization are now talking about. And they're saying they had their Disease X games where they were modeling the future response of the future unknown pandemic. And the World Health Organization is now saying that we need preparations and possible restrictions to prepare for a disease that has not yet come to exist. And they're talking about unfreezing ice to release frozen ancient pathogens. And the Chinese Communist Party has created a new virus that has a 100% death rate, at least in mice. So Disease X. Join me tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time for that. Those of you on YouTube, Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'll do the whole episode, but Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'll do most of the episode and the Q&A on Epoch TV, but still join us for maybe the first 15, 20 minutes. And again, that's partly because, well, first of all, YouTube censors me, but second of all, because there's a lot of stuff I can't talk about on YouTube. Even if YouTube uncensors me, I'm planning to keep this model because I need to be able to talk about things that they don't want me talking about. And what I will do is, of course, take the topics that they censor and put them on the days where I know I'm going to be on Epoch TV and not on YouTube. So join us on Epoch TV for that marketplace of ideas, the uncensored discussions we can have to find truth together. All right, folks, that said, thank you all so much for being here. Please take care of yourselves. And as always, please take care of yourselves. Stay informed and stay free. Thank you.